the idea for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a good idea because, there needed to be negotiations. So a very good idea. The only drawbacks was, as I said, when it started, war was still going on in two big states, in two big provinces. So a lot of people did not come to the TRC because they were still traumatized, still displaced from their homes, still not trusting the system. Because the first time Nelson Mandela went out of South Africa, he came to Ethiopia. And the first place where he was taught how to use a gun was in Ethiopia, So Ethiopia really contributed. And of course, Ethiopia also gave him a passport so he can go to other countries. So Ethiopia, I just wanted to say that Ethiopia really played a big role in Nelson Mandela's, becoming a revolutionary. Without confronting difficult questions about ethnicity, about nationality, about racism, we're not going. Those are difficult questions for Ethiopia, the question of nationality, for South Africa, the question of racism, for Kenya, Rwanda, the question of, tribalism or racism. Those are difficult questions, but they must be confronted so that if we are serious of building a united society, all of us need to know that we must be committed to nation building.
Though the magnitude of the crisis varies, almost every country has passed through conflicts, so the difference is either dwelling on the conflict or moving forward with a progressive outlook. South Africa had experienced a divisive politics that eventually exposed it for massive conflict and grave injustice. That was a painful history. However, South Africans didn't allow that painful history to dominate their future. Rather, they reconciled with themselves. And now South Africa has become one of Africa's giant economy, Africa's pride, and relatively peaceful and democratic country in Africa. Hello and welcome, viewers. Today on our weekly edition Messenger, we would love to hear the history of South Africa, its history, its transition from conflict to democracy. And my guest for today is Professor Sipho Madlingozi, who is Director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Witwatersrand University, Johannesburg, South Africa. He's Associate Professor at the School of Law at the same university. He is a research associate at Nelson Mandela University. He is also a visiting professor at the International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and a faculty member at the Vienna Master of Art in Applied Human Rights. He has written enormous articles, research, and books. So we are reaching Professor Sipho Madlingozi via Zoom. He is in South Africa today. Hello, Professor. Can you hear us?
I can hear you, and good afternoon, good morning. I don't know what day is it where you are now, but I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, in the time of recording, it's evening in Ethiopia. Anyway, thank you for joining us, Professor Sipho Madlingozi. It's great to have you in my show, Professor. So you are here to share the experience of South Africa in terms of implementing transitional justice. So apparently, South Africa had implemented transitional justice because there was injustice in the past, right? So can you briefly tell us the cause and the consequence, the outcome of conflict and injustice in South Africa? Let's begin with this.
South Africa was under colonization, colonialism. The difference between South Africa and most African countries is that most African countries were colonized from the late 1800s, right? South Africa was colonized from the 1600s, so from 1652 up to, let's say, 1994. So it's a long history of colonization, more than 300 years. Most African countries about 100 years. For South Africa, it's almost 400 years of colonization, and the colonization really was from the European settlers coming from Netherlands and France and coming to colonize South Africa. And by colonization, of course, colleagues women, took the land, enslaved some people, killed a lot of people, make sure that some people were working for them for free, wage slave labor. And when people tried to resist, they were either killed or they were, put in jail. So this was from 1652, and then there was a conflict for 100 years. From 1789 to 1889, there were about 13 wars that were fought, about 13 big wars where Black South Africans were trying to fight the European colonizers, 13 big wars. And Black people lost all of them. And so after they lost all of them, they were conquered, so colonized and then conquered, their land taken away, and then South Africa was formed. So South Africa is a very, it's a new country. It was only formed in 1910, formed after Black people were colonized. From 1910, South Africa formed. So then that conflict continued, and then apartheid came later on. Apartheid came in 1948. So from colonization, then apartheid in 1948. So people always say South Africa apartheid, but it's a mistake. Apartheid was very short. It was only from 1948 to, 1994. The bigger conflict, the longer conflict was colonization, which was more than 300 years. Apartheid was very, very short. So that's what I want to share with your viewers, that let's be careful when we talk about South Africa. Apartheid is nothing. It's very, very short, only 50 years. The bigger problem was colonization. So that ended in 1994, as you know. So there was war, but no one won the war. And then there was negotiations. So that's when then Nelson Mandela came into power in 1994. Yes.
So South Africa's transitional justice had undergone various stages, and I'll come to those stages step by step later in my show. But first, can you tell us how the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatant forces was done in South Africa?
Yes, so the way the conflict ended was that it was through negotiation, of course. So no side won. For some places like Rwanda, Angola, one side wins and then implements a transition. Here, no one won. So the two parties had to come to the table and to negotiate. So there was a negotiated peace agreement between the two parties. But before the negotiation could start, the ANC, the party of Nelson Mandela, had to agree that they will stop fighting, had to agree that they will give up their arms, had to agree that they will be part of the South African army. So it was part of the negotiation that the ANC, the one side, would give up their weapons, would give up the fighting. They will, they will disband their army. They disbanded their army, and that's how the disarmament happened. And then some of them were then integrated into the South African army. But the integration was not very smooth. Number one, a lot of people who were in the Liberation Army were not included. Or some of them did not want to be included. They said, we don't want to be part with the enemies. We don't want to be part of the enemy, army. So some of them, did their own thing. Those who agreed to be part were integrated into the South African army. It was not very easy at all. There were a lot of fights, even in the army. I am from a place called Bloemfontein myself. And in Bloemfontein, there's an army barracks. And there were shootings at that army barracks between the Liberation Army people and the old South African people, because they still did not like each other. So really the disarmament was smooth because there was negotiation. But in terms of the coexisting, who's going to be the general, who's going to be the chief of staff, that was not quite easy, but it did happen, and that was the nature of the transition. What made it possible was that the two parties agreed on an amnesty, because an amnesty, as you know, says we are going to give you an amnesty, and we're not going to prosecute you for what you did in the past. So we're going to give you an amnesty. And that promise of an amnesty is the one that allowed the two parties to put down their arms. So amnesty was a condition for disarmament, yes.
Yes, I understand that the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of the ex-combatant forces was a very critical step that paved the way for discussion, negotiation, reconciliation, and all kinds of talk. So how the truth and reconciliation process has undergone?
So the truth and reconciliation process was part of this negotiation. The two parties were negotiating, and they were agreeing that, we're not going to prosecute either side. We're going to not prosecute, we're going to give each other amnesty. But then the negotiation said the amnesty is not going to be a blanket amnesty. It's going to be an individual amnesty. So the difference between an individual amnesty and a blanket amnesty is that a blanket amnesty says all the soldiers get amnesty. An individual amnesty says one by one, they must come and apply. I am Sebo, I'm coming to apply for amnesty, and this is why I deserve an amnesty. Okay, so individual amnesty, not blanket amnesty, like in Argentina, where it was said everyone gets amnesty. But this one is an individual application. So that's very, very crucial. As part of that, people said, okay, you'll give amnesty to soldiers, but what about the victims? A lot of people were killed during apartheid. What are you going to do with them? And also, number two, how are you going to build a nation? How are you going to make sure that there is a united society? That's where the idea of truth and reconciliation came from. Right? Truth and reconciliation. Truth, if you tell the truth, you'll get amnesty. And if you are a victim, you come to the TRC and you tell your story. This is what happened. My father was killed. This is what happened. I was raped. My house was burnt down. That is part of reconciling the nation. So that's where it was coming from, truth, reconciliation. And then the third component was reparation for victims, compensation or reparation for victims. So amnesty for soldiers, reparation for victims. So it started in 1996 for only 2 years. From 1996 to 1998, there was Truth and Reconciliation. And that Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the biggest in the world, ever in the world. It was the biggest, 100 hearings, and a lot of people coming to tell their stories. So it was historical for the whole world because it was the first time that so many people could come and tell their stories. It was an individual amnesty application, and it was on TV. It was not hidden. It was on TV every evening. It was shown, to the nation. So very, very big, very, very public. So it was a good thing because, the perpetrators could come and tell their stories and tell the truth. And if they tell the truth, they get amnesty. The victims on the other hand could come and tell their stories and then get reparations. So that was a good thing. But it did not work out like that, unfortunately. It did not work like that, and it was not a smooth process.
So following the truth and reconciliation process, the victims and the perpetrators of crime were identified, and amnesty was given for some of the criminals, and prosecution of certain crimes was done, and victims were compensated as well. So how this process had undergone, and what were the drawbacks of the transitional justice process in this regard?
Yeah. So just to summarize, because I've already said it, for your last question in terms of reparations, not enough reparations. And remember, when we were talking about colonialism and apartheid, reparation and compensation must be to individuals, but it must also be to communities, because there were communities that were completely destroyed. So that did not happen. So The compensation one, not enough compensation. The amnesty one is also a problem because most perpetrators who came to us for amnesty were from the ANC, not from apartheid. So apartheid soldiers and generals, not enough of them came. The majority of people who came were from the other side, the ANC. So you can see the imbalance there. The idea for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a good idea because, there needed to be negotiations. So a very good idea. The only drawbacks was, as I said, when it started, war was still going on in two big states, in two big provinces. So a lot of people did not come to the TLC because they were still traumatized, still displaced from their homes, still not trusting the system. The second drawback was that it was too short, only 2 years. That's too short. That's too short. So a lot of people were excluded because it was so short. The third drawback was that there has not been enough reconciliation because there was no moments where perpetrators apologized to victims or where white people as a whole apologized to black people as a whole. Okay? And also on the issue of land, remember I said colonization was about taking the land. Land has not come back, enough, So because no land has returned, there's still a lot of bitterness, a lot of anger, And then the last drawback, not enough compensation was given to victims, not enough reparations was given, In every post-conflict situation, victims must receive reparations. That was not the case. There was not enough reparations that was given, So I would say in a nutshell, my brother, those were some of the drawbacks. But in terms of institutional reforms,
do you think the transitional justice process in South Africa was unsuccessful? Because there are some critics who argue like the transitional justice process in South Africa was not successful. The process didn't answer the fundamental questions of justice. So what's your position here? And what's your argument? What's your parameter to say that the transitional justice process was successful or unsuccessful?
Yeah, my position is based on the 4 drawbacks that I gave. Not enough truth, not enough reparation, not enough reconciliation. So the commission was called Truth and Reconciliation. But no truth came out. No reconciliation happened. No reparations happened. No land came back. So if you look at all of that, I would say that, the process was not a complete success. It was not a complete success. What should have been done differently? Timing should have been different. The period must have been different. Compensation should have been enough, So that's my position that, there were a lot of drawbacks. That is why some of us are asking for another Truth and Reconciliation Commission now, so that we can really have the truth, have reconciliation, and have healing for the victims, Victims are still not healed, They're still very traumatized. They're still very bitter. So there's not enough reconciliation, So that would be my answer there, yes.
All right. So Professor Chifo, so from your vantage point, what are the good sides of the transitional justice process in South Africa?
The good side is that it enabled victims to come and tell their stories in public. And these are people who, for years, they have not been listened to. For years, their pain had not been acknowledged, So for them to come publicly and tell their stories, and the nation to listen to them and acknowledge their stories, I think that's a good thing because, if you're a victim and you get to tell your story, that's how you heal a little bit. That's how you heal, So for me, that was a good thing. The second good thing about the South African transitional justice was that the amnesty was not a blanket amnesty. It was individual amnesty. So every single person had to come and say, my name is Tepo, this is what I did. Please give me amnesty. Not a situation where we say everyone get amnesty. That individual kind of, system was very good. The third good thing was that, the TLC, process, the hearings were all public, all on TV, all on radio, all in the newspaper. So a very open public process. Because of course, what it means that the more people see this, the more they know that things were actually very bad. And that we must not do this again as a country to each other. We must not do this, So for the future, the more people see how bad things were, and the stories were very painful. The stories were horrific. People talking about their loved ones being burned alive. People talking about being raped and things like that. So because those stories were so public, maybe, it says to people, we mustn't do this again. Those were some of the good things.
All right. So what kind of institutional reforms have been made to further cement the benefits of transitional justice in South Africa?
So the first reform was to make sure that the police is a civilian police force. It's not a civil force. It's not a police force that is meant to oppress people. So it was completely changed. Even the name changed. So the name changed, the uniform changed, the attitude changed. So the police was the first one. The second one was to have a new constitutional court. A new constitutional court, which should be a court really to hear constitutional human rights disputes. Okay? So second constitutional court. Thirdly, of course, the establishment of several national human rights institutions. So a human rights commission was formed. A commission for gender equality was formed. A commission called the Commission for Independent Electoral Reforms. So for independent elections was formed. The Independent Electoral Commission was formed. Fourthly, a public protector was formed. A public protector is like an ombudsman. It's like an ombudsman. Option, they can go to it. So those kind of commissions were formed to support democracy. The other reforms that were put in place was, at the level of schools and universities to make sure that the correct history is taught. Because of course, with a correct history, you are able to reconcile because you are telling the truth of what happened, So, a curriculum reforms in the history of the schooling was also established. But the biggest institutional reform was the adoption of a constitution, a new constitution, a constitution that guarantees fundamental rights to everyone, the right to freedom of movement, the right from torture, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to equality, the right to citizenship, things like that. So constitutional reform was the biggest one because it then laid a vision for the future, what kind of society we want to be, So those were some of the big institutional reforms, a new, police force, a new, constitutional court, new institutions to support democracy, the Human Rights Commission, the Gender Commission, Public Protector, Independent Electoral Commission, curriculum reforms, the Constitution, but also, at the level of memorialization, at the level of commemoration, new holidays, new national holidays were put into effect, So, a holiday for reconciliation, a holiday for Freedom Day, a holiday on Youth Day, a holiday on Women's Day. Those are days when people stop and reflect on some of the gains that we've made, you know. So those are some of the key reforms.
All right. So when I think of South Africa, the first thing that comes to my mind is the late president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, and his contributions, his sacrifice for better South Africa. So can you explain the contribution of Nelson Mandela, in particular his contribution in terms of leadership for the success of transitional justice in South Africa?
Of course, there's a connection between Mr. Nelson Mandela in Ethiopia, because the first time Nelson Mandela went out of South Africa, he came to Ethiopia. And the first place where he was taught how to use a gun was in Ethiopia, you know. So Ethiopia really contributed. And of course, Ethiopia also gave him a passport so he can go to other countries. So Ethiopia, I just wanted to say that Ethiopia really played a big role in Nelson Mandela's, you know, becoming a revolutionary, you know. And, you know, he was in jail for about 27 years. And that's a long time, you know, in jail for 27 years. And when he comes out, he says, I don't want to fight. I don't want us to do to white people what they did to us, you know. So really, we call him the father of the nation because he was playing a reconciliation role. He forgave, you know, people who did horrible things to him and his wife and his family. He completely forgave them and therefore gave an example to the world, to South Africa, that after conflict, you don't need to be bitter. Sometimes you need to talk, negotiate, reconcile, you know? And after he came out of jail, there were very difficult moments where the apartheid government was still killing people. And black people were angry, would say, no, let's fight back, let's fight. And he had to say, please, let's calm down, please, let's forgive them, you know? So really, he played a very big role by his example of forgiving people that did bad things to him, by his negotiating skills, by his compromises. He compromised on a lot of things to say, you know, on the economy, on the land, for the sake of peace, let's compromise, you know? And really, yeah, so those are some of the very good examples he gave: reconciliation, forgiveness, and compromise.
Professor, what would have been the cost of not implementing transitional justice in South Africa? Like, what kind of South Africa do you imagine hadn't there been transitional justice in South Africa?
I don't know, you know, because we are talking about what could have happened. But I would say two things. One, as I said, there had to be negotiation. And out of the negotiation, there had to be a process of trying to build a nation, you know? So that was important, you know, because it did end the war. It did end the conflict, that negotiation. On the other hand, I'm saying, you know, people always say South Africa is an example of a peaceful transition. Peaceful transition. But that's not true. As I said earlier, war was still going on. And a lot of people were killed, even during the transition. So it was not a peaceful transition at all, you know. But if there was no negotiation, if there was no transition, it would have meant that the apartheid system would have been in place for much longer. More people would have been killed maybe. And the process of building a new South Africa would have been postponed, you know? Yes. Mm-hmm. But that is not to say that there were no drawbacks in the transitional justice process, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, in your mind, what other African countries like Ethiopia learn from the experience of South Africa, from the drawbacks and from the success of transitional justice?
Negotiation is very important. Compromise is very important. You know, all sides have, you know, have got a claim that they were the most oppressed. Their people were killed more. But for the sake of going forward, people have to come around the table and they have to talk, unfortunately, you know. No one wins in a war. No one wins. No matter how much guns you have, how much bombs you have, how many people you have, no one wins, you know. So war doesn't benefit anyone. So the first lesson is that humility, compromise, negotiation. The second lesson is the lesson of doing a proper transitional justice process. Have enough time. Don't rush it. Don't do it for 2 years, 3 years. Do it for 5 years. Why not? You know, don't rush it. 2, give victims. Victims must be at the center of everything. Not the political elites, not the big leaders, but the victims. It must be a victim-centered process, you know? And that means the whole system must be, you know, created around victims. And they must be asked, what do you want? What do you want to see as victims? And by victims, I mean particularly women. In every war, women are the ones who suffer the most by being raped, by their children being killed, by their husbands being disappeared, by their, you know, homes being burned. So it must be a woman victim-centered process. There must be enough, you know, compensation for victims. The fourth reason is that if amnesty must be given, it must be individual amnesty. It must be individual amnesty, and people must ask for forgiveness. People must be asked for forgiveness, not just truth, but also forgiveness. It's very, very important. And then lastly, transition never ends, never ends. Even after 20 years, someone still comes and says, you know, my father is still missing. Please help me. Please listen to that. Don't say to them, no, no, no. Transitional justice happened a long time ago. We're not going to listen to you. No. So it must end at some point, but be willing to listen to people as they come later on, you know? And then finally, institutional reforms are very, very important. Institutional reforms to consolidate the peace, to consolidate democracy, to consolidate reconciliation. Because without institutional reforms, without the economy being distributed fairly, without confronting difficult questions about ethnicity, about nationality, about racism, you know, you're not going to go anywhere. And those are difficult questions. For Ethiopia, the question of nationality; for South Africa, the question of racism; for Kenya, Rwanda, the question of, you know, tribalism or ethnicity. Those are difficult questions, but they must be confronted so that if we are serious of building a united society, all of us need to know that we must be committed to nation building. Yeah, so those are some of the lessons.
All right. You have made a very good point. Professor Shifo Madlingozi, I really appreciate your time. I know you have given this interview in your busiest schedule, and thank you very much for your collaboration. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, and all the best, my brother. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and have a successful time, Professor. Dear viewers, that brings us to the end of our program for today. Many thanks for watching, and please do stay with the rest of our programs. Bye for now.